Horror and comedy are not the likeliest of bedfellows, but it works. The seminal Evil Dead series from Raimi and Campbell are one of the best examples of this in cinema. Tim Burton was also a master of bringing mirth and macabre into one place. His incredible Batman films were visually and cinematographically some of the most striking and impactful comic book adaptations still to this day. His mixture of gothic arc, caricature design and dark imagery worked perfectly for the Bat, Sleepy Hollow, and even the haunting stop-motion A Nightmare Before Christmas, a seminal release from Tim Burton at the time and still to this day. This film was a big inspiration for our next dig into the vast graveyard of video games in PlayStation exclusive that is just on the cusp of another resurrection for PS4 players this Halloween. Ahead of my autopsy on the gravely delights it offers up, I wanted to take a stroll down some ye old English heritage, Victorian majesty, and all things that go bump in the night. It's time to get medieval on your arse. James Pond is likely not the first thing you would think of when talking about a 14th century skeletal knight fighting the undead hordes, magic overlords and stained glass windows. On the back of two hugely successful James Bond parody games that made a huge splash on the 16-bit computers in the early 90s, being flipping fantastic on the Commodore Amiga, one of the most impressive and influential computers in history, I covered in depth in my dual Amiga versus Atari ST videos. Check them out for some epic blitter rivalry. This fin-filled 2D platformer was a huge hit and had a strong sense of parody, skill and style, which stood out on computers as a unique take on the platforming classics that dominated the consoles from Nintendo and Sega. The two games could not be further apart, being an impressive tail-end 16-bit action platformer and then a mid-gen free-roaming action-cum-puzzler 3D combat game. Many things were firsts. Lead developer Chris Sorrell was growing tired of Pond, and this new spooky title offered him and the small team from Millennium Interactive the chance to leap into the 32-bit world. Chris had joined the team after the third Pond game, where he coded the Mega Drive version himself to get the most from it. Leaving Vector Dean and joining Millennium Interactive, whom he had worked with since the first Pond, he was hired to help out with education software, and in doing such a bang-up job, they supported him on whatever he would love to do next. Dead Man Dan was that wish. The game was again a multi-platform release with Sega Saturn and PlayStation all in line for versions. As the company purse was light, a big push was made to secure a publisher early to aid funding of that development. As such, prototypes were made on Saturn to show to Sega. In 1996 though, Sony grew very interested in the game and later the team, with them securing it as a PSX exclusive, and then in early 1997 purchasing half of the studio, taking the Medieval squad and game in-house to become Sony Cambridge. James Pond was not part of the acquisition. Look, you love him, okay? Come on, it's good. And they parted ways with Chris as he set off into the world of PlayStation exclusives. Now, this long development period saw quite a few changes from its 2+ year development cycle. One of those was the shift from a Saturn prototype to the full game being made from scratch on PS1 hardware. The other was the emerging 3D games and oh so difficult camera that we take as a given now, one of the largest problems yet to solve then. Lucky for the team, two instrumental games were about to be released that would solve most of these issues for the rest of the industry. Mario and Lara gave everyone the reference and ability to understand how to ground your avatar in the world while allowing you a bird's eye view of the action at all key times, with high levels of accuracy and precision, most of the time. Equally as beneficial was the, and as then, brand new twin analog dual stock controller being in development, and Medieval was the first UK game and team to get hands on and launch with full support. This was the final piece of the puzzle that opened the door on the team's dreams of a Ghouls and Ghosts 3D actioner with aspirations of Zelda. Now looking back, it was, I believe, one of the biggest reasons for success and fond recollections for many of us. Not only was this a stunning land to explore, peppered with richly animated and hugely varied enemies and characters, but it felt controlled and played like something very fresh. Level variety was excellent, puzzles complex enough to demand thought, wrapped up in a control system and melee combat system that helped rather than hindered you. Going from digital to analog helped some of the more precise platform segments, but it still plays well on a D-pad, which again is easy for many of us to ignore now, but then it was among an elite group of games that had conquered the 3D game demons of control. It played immensely well with the L and R buttons used to rotate the camera when not fixed. You could attack the cadavers and keep your eyes on any impending danger yet to come. Now visually, it was a real stunner that used all the hardware tricks the PlayStation had to offer. Transparency was abundant from scenery, alpha smoke, magic spells and fire, all lavish with rich contrasting colours, extreme design and high quality CGI FMV sequences to embellish Daniel Fortescue's tale of redemption and resurrection. The entire project was brought to life by Jason Wilson, being the lead artist, co-writer and even voice of Dan himself. Can you imagine a Sony first party studio donning that many hats now? Times sure have changed. Luckily, he wore his 3 hats well, so much so that he returns in the remake as the voice of Dan again. We can but hope that voice capture sessions have moved on from a bucket on his head, which was the preferred method in 1997. With Chris taking the core programming load with his C64 and extensive Amiga skills, a testament to just how much he and fellow coders could squeeze from hardware. This carried over to the Sony machine and this team created something special. These early days of 3D gaming meant many things taken for granted now were exciting and new. Simply having an animated 3D character was a revolution. World geometry and textures were very simple with relatively low polygon counts, single layer textures were applied via per face mapping, limited by the geometric construction and faces per object. As already mentioned in the management of views, camera and perspective were all new challenges. As such, it was not widely known that the game was intended to be on rails, following a 2.5D spline through levels as a true evolution of a side-on platform origins of Ghouls and Ghosts. Think of it more along the lines of games like Panzer Dragoon. Now, some levels or segments still show signs of this. Thankfully, the skill and determination of the team, spurred on by the launch of Lara and Co during development, drove them to remove the stabilizers and deliver the free-roaming actioner we finally got. Design was also much harder with no 3D designer and animating tools to support such as Maya or Blender. Jason Wilson drew the characters and world on paper with biros and crayons, designing the levels to the limits of the vertex construction and even texture levels into simple tiles to help the artist craft them from the game. Set pieces, puzzles, boss battles, and even the CGI sections were all penned out in storyboard fashion, much like movies used to, known as shooting boards. Now this helps craft the camera shots, the visual effects, or even the moment-to-moment gameplay. The sheer vision Jason had is clearly visible here with a comparison from his paper art and the final game. The outcome was this pixelized version of a Tim Burton film with all the macabre gothic art, quintessential English humour, and that oh so lovable fumbling Dan looking to redeem his legacy, even if it kills him. You can check out much more on this on his blog links below, and it includes an interesting interview with Retro Gamer from a few years ago along with Chris Sorrell. Now the camera options were evident all the way to the end, and with the in-game debug mode enabling you to test these out with a variety of choices, including free roam and field of view choices, allows you to understand just how much they played around with these aspects, and a very similar camera system that's evident in the sequel, which I'll cover later in the video. Now the audio was a huge part of the game and is a great turning point for video game music drawing closer to film. The inspiration is clear though. Talented duo Andrew Barnabas and Paul Arnold, better known as Bob and Barn, worked wonders here with a Danny Elfman inspired orchestral score, but it was all created from synthesizers rather than a philharmonic orchestra. It portrayed a wonderful mix of haunting strings, deep trumpets and comedic pacing that matched the on-screen action. This balance of visual, horror and humour would not be as impactful without this incredibly deep and varied score. The foreboding terror that awaits the broken stained glass tunnel or that impending boss battle manifested a grander scale to all proceedings, a much bigger budget game than it actually was. They did such a good job, they ran the entire Sony sound department until the PS2 was about to launch. And in preparation of the remaster launching, if you can, sit down and play the PS1 original and indulge yourself in one of the finest soundtracks from the 32-bit era that still holds up today. Now the limits of the PS1 are evident, with the affine texture mapped environments warping often as vertex point popping from convex to concave. The lack of a depth buffer causes perception issues with characters popping behind and in front of scenery, but the Software Z solution does work well. The team use it alongside with vertex lighting and obviously Guru'd shading to help the textures on Dan to convey him entering darker areas or around light sources to light him up, like an early light map solution. The use of colour, additional texture mapped detail, exaggerated character design, complex levels that sprawl and intertwine. Even shortcuts can be found to give you a faster path back to an area or key item. This, in this sense, is really the original Demon's Souls or Dark Souls. The combat though is not that intuitive and it isn't that satisfying overall, but the animation is another high point. The gangly, awkward jaunt or run of Dan gives him a comedic charm like a pumpkin-inspired Charlie Chaplin or Norman Wisdom. Clumsy swings or jumps with legs hanging below him like two pieces of strings. The enemies are equally lavished in colour and charm, with pumpkins growing from the ground, fat farmers popping out of hay bales, or rabid skeletons attacking on board those ghostly vessels. The huge boss battles provide a grand climax to each segment and fit the relevant themes perfectly. The penultimate boss before Zarok is more pirate than the Chuck, me hearties.
Good! I want that scurvy dog dangling from yon yardarm by his bowels.
Is that really necessary? Couldn't we just give him a good tongue lashing and drop him off at the next port?
Look! There's not a man-jack on this ship who wouldn't keel-haul his own grandmother for the silver in her hair! There'll be no tongue-lashing! Bring the landlubber to me and I'll tear him a new orifice!
My name's Mitch. I'm the animator for the Medievil team. Basically, I do all the quirky little characters that make the game what it is. I get to take the characters, place them into an environment and generally add my own characteristics to them or people that I've seen. For larger characters such as Dan himself, he's got about 30 odd animations, so he takes a lot longer. People, the way they move, the way they talk, how they interact with other people. That's more of an inspiration for me than anything else.
The excellent use of memory here, with indoor sections being fully loaded into RAM and then warped to instantly when entering. This clever use of map design and space kept loading to a minimum of all times and is a huge gain with excellent memory management and loading times. Using the debug camera system, you can see the level construction of each themed world. Great use of sprite effects, textured transparencies on water and frugal triangle count makes for an impressive PS1 debut. You can literally move through the levels and see how they laid everything out. By hiding these sections, these indoor rooms on the far edge of the map, it means you could never see it from a distance, even though the level of detail was severely cool once you move back and forth. But it's a great use of that memory and allowed it to be drawn all at once when the level loaded, and then you can jump in and out of those indoor sections. A clever little touch on a game, and actually made it feel far closer to its cartridge inspirations of the generation before than the 32-bit CD-ROM that we were now used to, which delivered slow loading. The variety the game offers and pacing made it quite unlike anything else at the time, and in many ways it still has a unique experience with an unmistakable English humour, excellent pacing and a devious difficulty that really tests the best players. Later levels and bosses are incredibly tough and unforgiving, which can test your dexterity, awareness and patience, but you get much satisfaction when you do. The cheat mode does come in handy though when you no longer have endless hours to practice like you did back in the day. Now the game itself is a very impressive looking title, running approximately 540 by 480 here in interlace mode on the PS1, and it runs at 25 or 30 FPS in the States and Japan, and it holds that performance very well. It's one of the earliest games at the time I remember actually had mild bouts of tearing in the game because it uses a buffer system. That's the first time you would have seen this. Well, arguably the 3DO was the first time that was really used, but this was getting into that levels of actually drawing screens to a static image in a buffer, and therefore it does tear on occasion. Something that was much worse in the sequel, which I'll cover later, but overall it's a very solid performing title from beginning to end and holds on to that 25 FPS or 30 target without any concerns. Now, leaping a few centuries into the future, Dan finds himself thrust into a battle again with a demon this time. Victorian England is the setting, and a Cockney slang with spivs aplenty to keep Dan armed and ready for action. A love interest is introduced with a greater play on Dan's personal state, with a mixture of carry-on comedy charms and Monty Python dark humour. Jack the Ripper is another antagonist, with him cutting your love life right down. Thanks to a time machine, idol worship and some grave robbing later, you manage to save the girl and the day yet again with a smaller, more focused game.
Hold it please, sir. I need to see your membership card.
Now, a much shorter development cycle, about a year, and no Chris Sorrell this time. It meant it felt very different to the first, even if the setting was still Chris's idea. It revolves around the one Victorian theme, and levels are now sequential with a true single player linear construction. The map is now completely removed, although you can still replay levels once complete using the projector system. Far more emphasis is placed on characters, with a Casper style guard, Professor of Weapons and Kyra, the half bandaged mummy. This also means more cutscenes, and now many of them are in-engine. The improvements the team made enabled basic skinning of geometry, now giving characters more facial movement and improved triangle counts and texture quality. Now, this reduces the FMV CGI story updates, but they are still present and are also better quality in both rendering IQ and playback frame rate. Now, those cutscenes are again filled with the same British humour that feels more adult now at times and closer to Conker on occasion. In the almost 20 years since release though, some of the gags do fall flat, but I still had a chuckle as I played through the sequel again for this video. Animation helps alongside much more confident use of coloured lighting, vertex lighting, and that grid shading is used far more often now, and it's better here, enabling dark catacombs and fading torchlight moments in the game. You can see it dragging along the wall, giving that shadow and darkness, which again adds to the atmosphere and the believability of these catacombs you find yourself trapped in at times. Enemies are also ramped up with much more of them on screen and a variety of attack patterns or behaviour with friend and foe now. The improved texture quality and triangle count is most evident on Dan and other characters, with the bright colour palette and variety of tones and lighting really setting that Victorian tone. Boss battles are used more often here, but they lack the creativity of the first, something which comes across in the entire game. Puzzles are again good and varied, but are easier than one I found. In addition, the singular locales and themes offer less variety than one, which took you from old graveyards, town centres, haunted lakes, pumpkin farms, ghost ships and more. Here the level design is a museum, Victorian streets, Whitechapel and sewers, and they all follow a similar corridor layout and lack the ingenious crisscross nature and natural flow of the first game. It's never bad, but it's not as polished or impressive as one, with no level equaling the complexity of the time puzzle level, for example. Now, sound is again excellent, with a fitting score of strings and gothic charm. Voice is much better, and slanging zombies and overkeen Dixon of Dock Green whistleblowers. You can even dress Dan up now as the gent we always knew he was, complete with a Mr. Ben style reveal and an Order 1886 tash. Very dapper, Dan. Very dapper indeed. Now, a cut segment from 1 was the worm in your eye, which was planned as a level. The preceding cutscene is still present on the game's disc in the full motion video viewer. But for the sequel, this was extended to allowing Dan to take off his head and stick it on top of a zombie hand. You could then enter small sections Big Dan could never fit into, and I enjoyed this variety in the puzzles, making you look for sections to fit in when you hit a dead end. My only issue is that it was not used enough or as intricate as it could have been. Aside one frustrating chime jumping segment with the console's poor depth perception and pixel perfect requirements making it far harder, overall the segments in the game all succeed in adding more to the gameplay over that hack and slash element. Even though the hack and slash is probably one of the weakest parts of the game overall. It's more about the humour, the character design, the complexity, the puzzles, the boss battles, and all of those things added together that made the game much more enjoyable. The variety was the key here, not one single element. Sadly, the same cannot be said for the boss battles here in the sequel. They are weak in attack patterns and tells, with them mostly being cheap on your hit weakness and the enemy's overall strength. The final boss is one of the worst I have endured in many years. Unfairly weighted against you, lazy attack patterns, low health reduction, weak design, and general sums up the rest of the game's main enemies. The Jack the Ripper element is a good example. It was an amazing story touch that would have worked perfectly with the Victorian era, and again it's almost wasted here, and I felt frustrated even at the time, thinking they didn't do enough with it. Without resorting to a cheat here, I would have lost the effort to complete it, as it was a dull affair complete with a cheesy ending as the two lovebirds get laid. To rest, obviously. Now, control is better, with the camera having less frustration than the first game, now using full rumble and both sticks. It is far more intuitive and free most of the time to swing the camera around in combat sections. Some of the boss battles do lock you into a fixed camera point though. But again, they waste some of those touches and some of the character elements they could have really pushed out on, which I feel the first team would have done. Jack the Ripper is a perfect example that synonymizes the whole point I'm trying to make. It was a great touch, a beautiful Victorian addition that could have added loads more to the actual game character, and that boss battle could have been far better realised than it actually was. But in the end, he's nothing more than a cameo, even if the scene leading up and driving you to push on to actually seek revenge is actually quite good and fits the humour well. Performance is a little worse. Some of those visual improvements, the lighting, the AI, and the load on the geometry, which is much better. The draw distance is further out, therefore they're pushing more triangles in that PS1 geometry engine. It means that it can suffer, and that means the tearing that happened in the first game are now ever present here in many sequences. This is probably one of the worst you're seeing now around the fountain. It's the combination of those sprite water transparency doff effects, strong levels and high levels of geometry, the AI characters attacking you, strong vertex lighting and dynamic light sources with coloured lighting. All of that adds additional load on the engine, therefore performance can dip. It's never bad, and it's never often, because this is probably the worst point you'll ever see, but there is points where there's lots and lots of characters in very enclosed areas, and that happens again, which again does point to the fact that it might be the limited MIP level that the CPU had, pushing all those levels of AI characters. I use the word AI obviously very lightly, but again back then it was all attack patterns and animation systems along with the geometry, so it does tear, it does stutter. It is a lower performing game overall, but it is doing a lot more with the same hardware. So that's always the battle you push when you're using the same hardware 5-6 years in. There's only so many tricks you can pull off. It's overall a shame really, as the second game was something of a mixed bag, offering improved graphics, sound, gameplay choices and cinematics, yet it falls down from weaker enemies, less variety and simpler puzzles. The cherry is the poor boss battles that culminated a game that runs out of steam around halfway through. The first is still the best. But wait! Before you backslang it out of here, this may not be bang up to the elephant, but there was another chance for Dan to redeem himself and have an additional resurrection. And this time, things got very handy indeed.
You, Fortescue! At last! Come, get up! We got things to do!
So to wrap up the coverage of this retro look back at a Halloween-filled treat, you can't keep a good man down, so they say, and Daniel Fortescue may not be good, but he's certainly dead, and Sony saw fit to resurrect him again with a launch title for the PSP. Originally planned to launch on the PS2, it's evident in the fact this is the closest we'll ever get to a PlayStation 2 version of Medieval, but due to the 1-year development cycle, give or take, they were forced to remake the original game. Some of the choices they took in that poetic license of a remake were for the better. Certainly Tom Baker was one of those, delivering his voice and excellent sarcasm and British wit and humour throughout the title as both the narrator and the Grim Reaper. He is a high point of the title itself.
The graveyard. You wouldn't catch me digging graves in my yard. Spoils the ambience. Cemetery Hill. An excellent name for a blues singer.
Daniel Fortescue's character himself is also very impressive, as are some of the creatures throughout the title. But generally the change of story, it tries a little too hard with its comedy. There's far too many cutscenes and dialogue throughout the title. As great as Tom Baker is, in the end you get tired of hearing the one-liner jokes before each level loads in. But it still has that original Medieval charm, but it mixes up, I think, the original storyline that the team were going for on the PlayStation 2 to make a brand new Medieval, likely set in Aladdin's time and a completely different character, and then merge that into the remake, and therefore we get almost a quasi version of both sides of that, which doesn't really work, and only really muddies the original Medieval title, which I still think is a cracking game, and I prefer that story, mythology and flow of the title. And even though it's a little cheesier and sometimes obviously much weaker in development, it's a much smaller time, much smaller studio back then, it still holds a better, more nuanced charm than I think this remake does, although the PSP version was pushed very hard. Like I say, they had a very short window to make this game. This means that they did an excellent job overall, and in fact, Chris Sorrell himself says in the Reference Retro Gamer interview how good he thought they did on that job, but I don't think even the original team were happy with the results. It doesn't feel as charming and as British as Medieval. It feels a little like it's trying too hard, like I say. Even though some of the level design and some of the flows and characters and enemies that they've added in are better, the game feels smaller and more enclosed due to a very corridor structure throughout, very limited, and the level design is nowhere near as good. It's significantly different to the point where a lot of the levels don't even match up in any way, shape or form to the original title. Some sections do, some sections don't, but overall it feels like a reimagining of that title, and it drifts a little too far. There are some funny points in it, like I say, some of the cutscenes and some of the later sections do make you laugh, and it is better produced both in soundtrack, which this time actually had a genuine orchestra from the original team that did the first title.
I am compelled by some primal force always to play this song of fear and sadness. Please, bring me new music, that I may break this cycle of endless misery. Go on, do us a favor. It's driving me mental.
But it doesn't really feel the same as the rest of them, and even though it's an excellent game to play on the go, and in fact it's the reason why I bought it at launch. I bought this with my original PSP at launch, and it's always great to sit down and play it around the Halloween table with your candles and pumpkins sitting around. It does feel excellent and sound brilliant. Visually, it's very impressive. Resolution-wise, it does hold up well on the PSP, but once blown up here, everything does look very jagged and shimmery. And the performance is very poor. In fact, it's the worst performing of all three that I've tested so far. Now, some of this is that short window of development cycle they had. They probably had no time to develop it, and they probably built this around the PS2 and its incredibly high bandwidth fill rate. Therefore, some of the effects, characters and geometry that were built into the game probably don't transfer that well to the PSP. Thus we see what is clearly a V-synced double buffered title dropping down often into 20 FPS. The maximum it can hit is 30, that is the ceiling. You can pick up some of the sections here when I'm indoors, that's as high as it possibly gets. But once you go into outdoor sections, it regularly drops down to that next V-Sync level of 20 FPS, then to 15, and it can hold that for some periods of time, and even go down to 12.5 FPS, and actually, probably, you could find points in this game that make it go even lower, down to 8, single digits. So, yeah, performance is a big issue on this particular title, and you do feel it a lot when you're playing. It feels chuggy and slow to respond, and therefore in a lot of the battles, even though they've done well with the control system using the right shoulder button to lock onto enemies and attack, it doesn't flow and feel as good as the previous games. And overall, even though it's a charming resurrection of that original title, it tries a little too hard. Some of the gags fall flat, and the mixture of the two stories means I'm only covering this to give everybody a clear view of the three titles that I think stand proud in the PlayStation 1's legacy, and certainly in the Sony Cambridge studio teams. It's a shame that the teams are no longer around.
Beware, imps are sticky-fingered thieves. Trust me, we can spot our own.
Fortescue stands proud as the PS1's high point in my opinion. It may drop down from 2 and certainly Resurrection, but the remake on the PS4 still has the opportunity to keep that family legacy proud. Anyway, this is it, the end of another retrospective. It was a long one, Halloween filled, and I hope you enjoyed it. And as I close the lid on another retrospective, I hope you all enjoyed this for your Halloween treats. If you did, try subscribing, liking, and maybe even giving me a few gold coins via Patreon. I am completely self-funded and rotting in my own tomb, so to help me clean it and get a little bit of meat on these bones, I could do with a few pounds. So please, give generously. Smash the like button down below. Otherwise, bats, demons, and angry pumpkins will come for you. Yes, angry pumpkins. I'll catch you on the next one. Angry pumpkin.